What I want to talk about this time, I'll sit down, I think, is the problem of the way in which the economy is developed in Eastern Europe, about their achievements and their problems, in a sense, and the way in which these are interrelated. If you like, the problem of economic crisis in Eastern Europe. You see, on the one hand, I think we have to say that the achievements of the East European countries in the post-war period were considerable and real achievements, if we consider economic growth and so on. On the other hand, we also have to say that the crises in Eastern Europe, economic and political crises, but here I want to focus on economic crises, those also were very considerable and very real. And what I want to suggest is that the successes and the problems are interrelated. They're not things you can discuss separately. The successes produce the crises, and the crises are related to the successes. And we need to get the two sides of the question together. I think there's a mistake which some writers make, like, for example, in the 1950s, there's a Trotskyist called Ernest Mandel, who sees only the growth in the East European economies and actually suggests that these economies will keep on growing smoothly and evenly, quite independently of their political system. He sees only the growth. On the other hand, there are writers like Tikhtin and Faraday and others in the 1970s and 1980s who only see the problems, only see the tendency to stagnation and crisis in these economies without seeing the growth. In other words, they see one side sees the growth without the blockages, the other side sees the blockages without the growth. I want to argue that the growth and the blockages are part and parcel of the same story, if you like, in the same way that if you talked about a capitalist economy, you couldn't talk about booms without talking about slumps, and you couldn't talk about slumps without talking about booms. Booms and slumps are part of the same process. Now, let's be clear about the achievements first. The East European countries achieved very real economic growth in the post-war period, often at quite a rapid pace. They achieved unevenly, but really, rising living standards for the great majority of the population. If you go to Eastern Europe and you visit people's homes, you'll find they've got fridges and televisions and so on, all sorts of things like this, and consumer goods, which they didn't have, and weren't available to them after the war. There's been a huge expansion in public education, massive expansion in the proportion of the population going into further and higher education, indeed into any sort of education. And until the 1960s anyway, there was an improved pattern of health in the population. The key index of human welfare, if you like, is the life expectancy. Life expectancy in Eastern Europe rose in the period from around 1948 through to the mid-1960s. I'll say something about it thereafter because it's quite stunning what happened in Eastern Europe after the mid-60s. There's been a process of urbanisation, expansion of the working class, the sucking of people out of the countryside into the towns, a predominantly peasant countries being turned into predominantly urban industrial countries, a growth of the educated classes or intelligentsia or middle classes or whatever you want to call them. These achievements are real. Of course, they're not peculiar to Eastern Europe. If you looked at other backward parts of the world in the same period, you'd also have to say that the same process has occurred. Not in all of them, but in many of them. The whole world economy, after all, grew in the post-war period in a more or less continuous process of boom from the end of the war, with a short stagger in the mid-1940s, until what? About 1970. The longest boom in the history of the world economy. And the achievements in Eastern Europe were matched in Southern Europe, for example, in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal. They were matched to some degree in Brazil and in Mexico, which also had been converted from overwhelmingly agricultural and even hunting countries, in the case of Brazil, into countries with very extensive urban industrial sectors, and so on and so on. Similarly with countries in the Far East, and so on. So the achievements of Eastern Europe are not entirely peculiar to Eastern Europe, by any means. In some cases they've been surpassed in other parts of the world. And of course, typically, these are achievements anyway, which we associate with industrialism, with capitalism, and so on. Now, what I want to go on and say, though, is that these achievements themselves, these successes, engendered crises. That the growth in practice was uneven in East European countries. That's where I want to focus the attention, Eastern Europe. That the growth had a cyclical pattern of something equivalent to boom and slump. And over time, if you look at the experience of all the East European countries, growth became increasingly difficult to achieve. The biggest growth rates occur in the early period, in the 50s. As these economies matured or developed or came nearer to our own time, they slowed down. Now, let's look at them a bit more closely. On paper, these economies were planned economies. I say on paper because when you look more closely, you find that what was written down in the plans was sometimes only tangentially related to what actually happened. But they clearly were centrally administered. Now, the basic planning organisation in these countries was taken over really from the USSR, from the model which was developed in Russia in the 1930s. It was modified later, but in its essentials, there's a lot of kinship between the principles of the planning system in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary and that in Russia. The essence of that planning system, if we consider it politically or socially, is that it was hierarchical. How did it work? Well, the economy is made up of a series of enterprises, which are themselves run by ministries. And the ministries who run the enterprises themselves receive instructions from the central planners. And these instructions, which the central planners issued to the ministries, and which the ministries then issued on down to the enterprises, these had the force of law. They weren't just kind of advice, they were instructions which had to be obeyed. And these instructions, which the planning organisations issued, the central planners issued, covered such things as the output which was to be achieved by this enterprise over a given period, over a period of 5 years, or over a period of a year, or over a period of a quarter, or even over a period of 1 month. The output they were to achieve was in the instructions. So also in the instructions was the inputs they were allowed to use, the labour they were allowed to employ, the raw materials they were allowed to use up, the investments they were allowed to make. So outputs and inputs are controlled in principle by the centre. All these enterprises, of course, are owned by the state, and it is the state which collects in any profits or surpluses, or whatever term you want to use, which these enterprises generate. This is an economic system in which all the significant investment decisions, all the significant decisions about production, all the significant decisions about what the enterprise can buy in and so on and use, are decided by the state, by the centre. That's to say, there's very little autonomy of decision making for the local manager of the enterprise. Now, if you consider this very centralistic system, it's one which burdens the planners with a massive task. Because what they've got to do is to ensure that all the enterprises in a complex economy are getting all the inputs they need, and that they're all producing the output which is needed by other enterprises and by consumers, and that transport is developed and coordinated to connect all these enterprises together, and so on. And that, if you like, supply and demand in the economy are matched all the time, without using money, of course, as a mechanism for matching supply and demand, but rather this is a system of physical allocation. That so much, if factory A is to produce sewing machines, then so much steel has got to be provided at the right time to that factory, and the transport system's got to be coordinated to it, which means that the steel plant has got to produce the steel to get to the sewing machine factory, which means that the coking plant has got to get the coke and the iron ore pit has got to get the iron ore to the steel plant and so on. All of this is centrally controlled. Rather than the market playing the part of allocator, if you like, of resources, the state planners do this. Now this is a huge task, and it engenders, of course, I mean, something which is notable about these societies, it engendered a vast paper-shuffling bureaucracy. Kagalitsky, in his book, The Dialectic of Change, quotes one industrial association in Russia that it will do, this is in the year 1981, which had to compile 49 volumes of technical data for approval by the planners. This is one enterprise. Had to produce 49 volumes of technical data and collect 900 signatures and official stamps in the year 1981. This is an enterprise having to produce 49 volumes of technical data, collect all these stamps and signatures as a condition for continuing as an enterprise. Now, there's a tendency in the West to sneer at this and say, look how all these people wasting their time shuffling paper in Russia. We should be careful in terms of sneering, because if you walk down any high street in Britain, you will also see that we have our own vast army of paper shufflers, only they're differently organised. Not in the central planning organisation, they're in things like building societies, banks, estate agents, solicitors, account offices in every book. In other words, there are also processes of shuffling of paper and ownership records and so on. There's a very large part of the population which is engaged in not dissimilar activities in some way in the West. Also unproductive, if you like. Now, this is a hierarchical system, very, very hierarchical indeed. There is essentially no control over this system from popular democracy. Nor is there really any major control over this from the market. Internally, these are not, if you consider these countries on their own, they're clearly not market societies. So we have to ask where the content of the plan comes from. I mean, it's one thing to describe a planning system in the abstract. Of course, this is not this is a planning system where the plans actually got definite directives, definite targets, and so on. The content of the plan, the idea, the purposes of the plan, come from the top of the hierarchy. They come from the party leadership, the state leadership. And it is the assumption, at least in the classic model of this, if you like, that the party leadership knows the interests of society and pursues the interests of society through its directives to all the different sectors of the economy. If you like, but like Nanny, it knows best what society needs. And this is associated with, of course, the repression of conflict in society, or simply the non-recognition of conflict in society. That there might be competing interests and so on is not recognised in this. This is a monocentric, monolithic model of planning, if you like. All the system of both coercion and of incentives, if you like, sticks and carrots, which are organised in this kind of society, are directed towards the fulfilment of the plan. Not to fulfil the plan is to risk being sanctioned. In the 1930s, being shot as an agent or as a fascist hyena in Russia. In the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, losing your bonuses. There's a system of bonuses, rewards and punishments which are attached to for plan fulfillment. So this is an imposed planning system, a hierarchical imposed planning system based on the issuing of commands from the centre. Now, there's been a whole series, there's a massive literature, which I don't intend to take you through, which raises a whole number of technical and political objections to this sort of way of running an economy, but in the abstract. Too often these kinds of economies are discussed in the abstract as if the actual goals of the planners can be ignored, as if the overall aims of the rulers, like their project, can be kept quite separate from discussion of the planning mechanism. I would suggest that's not true. that this whole system, in a sense, the whole planning system, was constructed with a purpose in mind and was maintained with a purpose in mind. And that purpose was fundamentally the rapid industrialization of backward countries. It was the development, as fast as possible, of the economic and military power of the various states in competition with the rest of the world. And that project, in a sense, dominated the real planning system. And it was that project which fueled a good deal of the irrationalities and the crises of this highly bureaucratic system. You see, one of the characteristics of indeed a key characteristic of the East European system was the high level of what was called accumulation as a proportion of the gross national product. What does that mean? It means that the proportion of the economy that was saved, as it were, rather than spent and put back into investment. It was much higher in Eastern Europe than it was in Western Europe in the 50s. And it rose in the 60s and 70s to even greater heights as a proportion of gross national product. And all the focus in this accumulation process, this saving and reinvestment process, all the focus, of course, was on the capital goods sector, on heavy industry, and on military goods. For example, in Russia and in the East European countries, all those states spent a much higher proportion of their gross national product on the military account than did Western countries. If we ask why that was, of course the answer is fairly straightforward. In order to match, if you like, tank for tank and missile for missile, given that their economies were more backward, it cost them more as a proportion of their whole economies. The more backward the economy, the greater the strain of military expenditure, because you have to match military expenditure to military expenditure. You can't fight tanks with bows and arrows. And these days, as was discovered in the Gulf, you can't fight modern air forces with tanks. Now, the stress in all of these economies was on the development of giant enterprises, huge factories, huge pits in the mining areas of Poland, for example. The pits employ thousands of workers. In Britain, the typical pit employs hundreds of workers. The typical one in Poland and Eastern Europe employs thousands. The shipyards were vast. The Gdansk shipyard in, for example, the Centre of Solidarity in 1981, 15,000 workers working in a single shipyard. Much bigger than the labour force, for example, when we had a shipbuilding industry in this country, on the Clyde or on Tyneside, for example. There was a tendency to close down small enterprises, and including, of course, artisan enterprises, small manufacturing, and there was a much more, if you like, much more monopolistic, concentrated pattern of industry than existed in the West. Now, I said that there's a central project in the planning system, and it was the effort to grow very fast. And the problem with the effort to grow very fast is that very often the plans were more ambitious than could be achieved. Over-ambition was a constant characteristic of the plans, or, as it was sometimes called, the plans were always taut as against loose. They always set targets which were only achievable under the most favourable circumstances. In practice, what happened was that the plans quite regularly proved to be beyond the actual capacity of the economy and the society to realise. The plans were not realisable. But there were several effects. You see, the problem with this is that it generates spin-off effects, and we can mention a number of these. First one is that there's a constant tendency for these economies to be economies characterised by shortages. Now, the most obvious example of shortages is in the field of consumer goods. Housing. There's a constant pressure for housing. The housing shortage is a perpetual concern of the population in East European countries. Shortages of such things as clothing, foodstuffs, consumer durables and so on. I mean, I was in Gdansk in the summer of 1986, and we were walking through the shopping centre there, and there's a queue formed outside a shop. About 100 people all standing patiently with their shopping bags in a queue, and we stopped to ask them what they were queuing for, and the answer was toilet paper. Because a supply had arrived. There had been a shortage of toilet paper, and suddenly a supply had arrived, and everybody was queuing up, and they were carrying off sacks of toilet paper, hoarding of toilet paper. Whereas we all assume we can go down to the shops and buy a roll of toilet paper if you need one. You could. This was in Poland, in Gdansk. But I mean, if anybody who's been anywhere in Eastern Europe will report similar sorts of phenomena. But you see, the problem is not simply a shortage of of consumer goods, and I think we could think of toilet paper as a consumer good, but it's also a shortage of producer goods and raw materials, because the plans, in a sense, are always trying to drive the economy forward. There's always a tendency to over-ambition and to putting forward proposals for development for which the materials don't exist and can't be achieved, it can't be easily obtained. So one of the effects in all the East European economies, as in Russia, was that there was a tendency to start more investment projects than they could complete. And one of the phenomena of the landscape of East European countries is unfinished investment projects. That's to say, building sites with nobody on them, which have been started and then have stopped. I mean, they will eventually be completed, but in the interim, they are abandoned. And we could say, in a sense, that the East European economies, in a sense, had a tendency to run into a number of barriers of their own making, in some ways. One of those barriers is what we might call a raw materials barrier. I'll mention some other barriers in a minute. What it meant was that the planners couldn't in practice guarantee that all the needed inputs would in fact be available for investment. They wouldn't be available necessarily in the quantity that they were needed, whether it be bricks or cement or steel or a railway line or whatever. They wouldn't necessarily be available in the quantity they were needed, or perhaps even more significantly in the quality they were needed, and at the time they were needed. Now, the effects of this on this pressurized system, which actually was a system which generated shortages all the time, this had a number of effects on the actual managements of the enterprises. The manager of this or that enterprise had to respond to this kind of situation. And the responses are learned in the early 1930s in Russia, and then they're repeated all across Eastern Europe. All the writers about these economies report the same thing. It's quite phenomenal how much unanimity there is amongst the writers. There's a tendency for the managers in the enterprises to hoard, rather like the people hoarding toilet paper, because there may be a shortage again, buying more than you need, hoarding materials and hoarding labour, on the grounds you might need them tomorrow. You can't be sure of the supplies. It's fairly rational behaviour. It's what Kagalitsky in his book calls the hamster principle. You know, if any of you have seen pet hamsters, offered food, they don't eat it, they shove it in their mouths and take it away for later. Well, offered goods or supplies of raw materials and so on, the tendency of managers in Russia was to grab it and hide it. In fact, there were famous cases of people burying expensive steel products in their factory yards where it rusted, rather than rather than give it up there, because you might need it. They also, you see, they're constantly under pressure from the planners to pursue growth. Growth is painful, particularly if you can't be sure of having steady supplies of adequately skilled labour, steady supplies of raw materials, and so on and so on. So they had a tendency to hide from the planners what the real capacity of their plant was. To lie, in other words. To underestimate, to go for a soft. If the planners are drawing up a new plan for your factory, and you're a manager, the ideal plan for you is one which is very like what you did last year. Not one which says you will achieve 50% growth next year. 50% growth is going to be extremely difficult to achieve, especially since you know the planners won't in practice be able to deliver you the raw materials and so on that you need. So they had a tendency to understate their actual capacity for development. They tended to seek low targets for their plants, to cheat and to lie. And the planners, in response, came to learn that managers cheated and lied, and therefore issued them with higher targets than the managers said they could achieve. So there's a certain element of irrationality and game playing in the whole plan construction. Another thing which was characteristic of all of these economies was that a tendency towards sectionalism. You see, the most rational way in which you might organise an economy is to have specialisation. That's to say, you've got a plant, for example, which produces screws. And it supplies the whole economy with screws. You've got skilled screw workers and specialised screw machinery producing screws for the whole, all the different sizes and shapes and so on that people want. No. And then you'd have specialisation, efficiency in some ways. Problem is that you're a screw user. You're a machine building factory of some sort, of furniture building factory of some sort, you want screws. And the screw factory doesn't in fact provide you with what you need. So what do? You start making your own. Which means that you make your own, possibly less efficient machines. You've got workers who part of the time you've got less efficiency. You've got the disadvantages of not having a developed division of labour. And one of the characteristics of the Russian economy and also the European economies was this tendency towards autarky in the enterprise. That's to say, towards each enterprise producing for itself as many of its inputs as it could manage, rather than relying on unreliable suppliers, which meant, of course, a wastage of labour, a wastage of resources. It was inefficient. Another aspect of these economies was that, in practice, you couldn't rely, if you're a manager, on just the plan to get you what you need, the supplies you need. Let's say, again, you're this furniture manufacturer, and you want screws. And you can't actually make the screws. You've got to get them from a screw maker. How are you to get them if the screw maker is under no compulsion to deliver them to you? Because he's got all sorts of excuses and reasons. Indeed, there may be reasons why he can't. What are you to do? You've still got to get those screws, otherwise you won't meet your plan, and if you don't meet your plan for your factory, you won't get your bonuses, and maybe the manager will be sacked, and the KGB will come and investigate you, and goodness knows what. You've got to meet the plan. So you get in touch with a chap called the Tolkachi. It's the Russian word for fixer, and the Tolkachi are significant oilers of wheels in the European economy. A fixer. Well, I'm not sure if it's a Tolkach and more than some Tolkach. Anyway, the Tolkachi is singular or plural, but anyway, this was the Russian word, the fixer. And the fixer goes to see the maker of screws, the manager of the screw plant, and he says, the furniture cooperative really needs some screws, and would like to present you with a case of whiskey to show goodwill. And the screw manufacturer says, well, thank you, I shall pass this out to, this is a very generous gift from our comrades. We, however, have got a problem that we need such and such. And this whole catch moves on, and the whole series of deals are struck. This is independently of the plan. This is not a market operating, but a sort of a wheeling of the oils of an inefficient system, in a sense. And they're very important people who strike all these sorts of deals and so on. So there's the public life of the plan. Underneath it, there is another world of bribery and favours being struck and fixing and corruption and so on. Now, one shouldn't suppose that this necessarily is done out of pure self-interest, that people do it to line their own pocket. They do it to achieve the plan. And Kagalitsky, in his book, describes how when he was in prison in the early 80s, in the last years of prisoner in Moscow, he met people who had never met, who had been arrested for corrupt dealings, who'd never made a penny out of it. They had been doing these deals in order to keep the plan working. They had to use illegal methods to achieve a legal end, in a sense. Now, one of the effects of this, of course, is that, you see, on paper, the planners know what is happening. They are fed upwards with adequate information, and they issue adequate orders down. But since actually that's not quite real, the information which the planners gather from society is distorted in various kinds of ways. Is actually unreal. The planners don't know what is actually happening in whole sectors of the Russian or the Polish or the Czech economy. Now, considers a system as a whole, one of the results of this economy of shortages, this economy with a raw materials barrier, if you like, which is always trying to achieve more than it can achieve, is that what in practice emerges in these economies is a sort of stop-go cycle, or Russian-stop cycle in the whole economy. Because what happens is this, that a whole series of investments are started, then it's found that it can't all be completed. So some of them stop. The planners have to intervene further and switch materials and resources from one set of investment projects to another, so that some investment projects can be completed and others are stopped. So bricks and cement and steel and skilled workers and cranes and so on are switched from one site to another, from non-priority projects to priority projects. Now, there is an ordering of the priority, very broadly. The top priority projects are the military projects. The second order of priority is given to heavy industry projects. The consumer goods projects are lowest in the pecking order, if you like. So that all the plans anyway prioritise in those sorts of ways. But when it actually comes to the implementation of the plans, there's even more of a bias towards the military and the heavy goods sector. And when you look at the figures for the achievement of plans, you find there's a tendency for heavy industry to overachieve its plan and light industry or consumer goods industry to underachieve. And there's a cyclical movement to the economy. Eventually, of course, so the economy stops, or not stops, it slows down. The growth rate slows down. Of course, eventually, those projects which have been started are completed, and a new cycle of growth and a new cycle of ambitious plans is then started. So you've got a wave motion in the economy. Rather like a boom cycle slump. Boom and slump cycle, or boom cycle slump. Boom, slump cycle. But of course, this is in economies which are growing overall, and therefore it's rather that growth rises and falls. And then, of course, gradually it gets more difficult. In the first example of an actual stop is in Czechoslovakia in 1962-1963, when actually there is a negative rate of growth in the Czech economy. By the time it comes to the 1980s, there are negative rates of growth all over Eastern Europe at different times. Poland actually experiences a 24% drop in production between 1979 and 1981. Now, it's not only this, you can point to this pattern in the whole economy in terms of the growth statistics, and this is quite well documented. The same is true in the plant. The individual factory, there's a tendency for there to be a rush and stop cycle. And I've got a handout which I must remember to give you this week, but do remind me before we go, then I have to give you this handout, which is just a couple of examples I've quoted in the handout of one from 1956, a Polish factory, about how nobody does any work in the first third of the month. In the second third of the month, everybody works normally. In the third third of the month, when the plan has got to be achieved for the month, there is storming, people are working overtime, and so on. They're absolutely knackered at the end of the month, but they've got their bonuses, and they can't, then they sort of recover, and they have a period, at the beginning of the next month, they don't work very hard again, and people say that if you buy a stereo in Russia, you should always look at the date stamp on it, never buy one produced in the last period of the month. And there's a description of why, in another quotation I put on the handout, of how in fact they hammer the switches in rather than screwing them in. So on the last period of the month, massive, trying to finish. The same is also said about British factories. This is not entirely peculiar to them. It said never buy a car which is produced on a Friday, in Coventry, for example. A Friday job, when everybody's wanting to go home and they can't bother, and then just banging metal together and not bothering. Similarly, this is perhaps more systematic in these European economies. Now, all of this, of course, tends to promote low productivity. If you take these factors together, they tend to promote low productivity. Kagalitsky suggests, for example, that, quoting Russian economists in the 1980s, that there's a one-third underutilization of labour in Russian factories, for example. The morale of workers is low under these sorts of conditions. There's no steadiness to work. And the quality of production tends to be low. There is one of the phenomena of the East European economies, which has been increasingly noted, perhaps too much has been made of it even, is a tendency to the extensive production of goods which nobody wants. What's sometimes called producing for the warehouse, producing shoes, which are not, you see, the problem is the consumers have got relative control over what is produced. So there's a tendency to produce out of fashion or out of style clothing and shoes and so on and so on, which actually nobody wants, and therefore goes into warehouses. It's just waste in a sense. As I say, sometimes it's exaggerated, and one will get the impression from some writers, and I think Tikhtin is a good example of somebody who's silly in this direction, that nothing in the Soviet Union works and nothing in Eastern Europe works. This is simply silly. Nobody has ever complained about the quality of Kalashnikovs or Semtex. And if nobody has ever said that the London Underground is more efficient than the Moscow Metro, for example. The Moscow Metro is wonderful by comparison with the London Underground. Polish jam is a great deal better than Hartley's. If you've ever come across East European jams in the supermarkets, they're a real bargain. They've actually got fruit in them. They're extremely nice, good quality. It's not Polish sausage is extremely nice, and English sausage, according to the EEC, is not sausage at all, and quite right too. I mean, it's not the case that everything in Eastern Europe doesn't work and nothing is any good. But there is a systematic tendency to the production of waste, to waste production, which is matched, of course, in the West in different kinds of ways, but it is a characteristic of these economies and produces problems for them. Now, this economy of shortages, I said there was the raw materials barrier, if you like. There's another barrier which they face, which is we might call an inflation barrier. The difficulty is that, of course, money does not play the same role in Eastern European economies as it does in the West. It doesn't govern the prices of things. And so inflation doesn't appear as rising prices necessarily, it sometimes appears as rising shortages. There are forms which economists talk about of hidden inflation or repressed inflation. The growth of queuing for certain commodities, or a black market, two sets of prices, official prices at which you can't buy things, and black market prices, where SPIVs, or whatever you want to call it, Tolkachi and others will sell you things you want, but at black market prices, or sometimes prices set in Western currencies. One of the things, again, going to Poland in 1986 was phenomenal. When you went around any tourist area, the number of people who came up and asked you, change money, because there were actually two sets of shops. If you wanted to buy whiskey or other Western goods, you couldn't buy them in Polish currency. There were special shops called the Pevex shops, and these exist also in Russia and Czechoslovakia and so on, where you could buy things, all sorts of luxury goods, or so-called luxury goods, you could buy it, but only with dollars or pounds or German marks or yen. You couldn't buy them with Polish currency. And they were, the Polish population was therefore constantly hoping to get hold of Western currency. If you had friends in the West who could slip you the odd £10 note, this was an extremely valuable addition to your income. So there's an inflation barrier. Now, in practice, there's a third thing, which is that although there was always a tendency for these economies to try to be autarkic, that's to say to be self-sufficient, in practice, this applies more to the East European countries than just the USSR, because the USSR is so big. But the East European countries were always dependent on trade. In fact, some of them were more dependent on trade than some West European countries. Czechoslovakia is more trade dependent than France, for example. And all their economic difficulties were compounded, in a sense, by difficulties in relation to trade. There's a trade barrier as well. Problems of balance of payments. And of course in the 1970s and 1980s, problems of the balance of payments difficulties actually been translated into increasing problems with debt, both to the USSR and to the West. And there's a problem which they face, which is in relation to international trade, which is that the quality of production of particularly manufactured goods in Eastern Europe is not very high in competitive terms in the world market. Which means that it is less profitable to export or more difficult to export. That, you see, the sorts of goods, military goods, certainly have been, generally speaking, of a high quality coming out of Eastern Europe. But machine tools, cars and so on, what's the joke car? It's the Lada. There are jokes which are not absolutely unfounded, which have got some basis in reality about the quality of East European industrial products. Ton for ton, if you like, Eastern Europe gets less per ton for its manufactured exports than Western European countries do. It's more, the rate of profit on them is lower. It's more difficult for them to sell. They're constantly being pushed, actually, back into being producers for the world market of raw materials and semi-finished goods and foodstuffs. The examples I find it easiest to think of high-quality East European goods are food. There are some very nice things to be bought in from deli counters and so on, East European products. But if you want to buy a machine tool, you're more likely to go to the Japanese or the West Germans than you are to go to the Poles or the Romanians or the Bulgarians or the Czechs. Now the difficulty is that to the degree that they're pushed by quality difficulties towards exporting foodstuffs and raw materials and so on, to the degree that that happens, they actually have a tendency to reproduce their difficulties about raw materials. If Poland is, as it is, a major coal exporter, for example, it also is demanding, there's a problem about coal shortages inside Poland. So there's a trade barrier. There's a raw material barrier, there's an inflation barrier, and there's a trade barrier. And there's one last barrier we need to mention, which is the agricultural barrier. Because the whole tendency of these economies was, of course, to develop industry, particularly heavy industry, at the expense of consumption. And what this meant as far as agriculture was concerned was that agriculture was treated essentially as a resource to be exploited rather than to be developed. The underdevelopment of East European agriculture is one of its notable features. In the period after the war, the agricultural productivity of Western Europe, France and Germany and Britain and so on, rose by something like 50%. In Eastern Europe, agricultural productivity didn't rise at all. If you go around Eastern Europe, you will see large numbers of horses and cars. The electrification of rural areas is not complete, and so on and so on and so on. Which means that there's always been a problem about food shortages, about food supplies, and about the backwardness of agriculture. And the difficulty is it's not simply that there hasn't been investment put into agriculture per se, tractors for farms, fertilizers for agriculture and so on, but also the whole rural infrastructure has not been developed. There's been an unbalanced pattern of development. The tremendous development of the steel industry, the coal industry, or whatever, petrochemicals industry, but a lack of development of the rural infrastructure, so that, for example, the milk supply in Warsaw, when I was there, in the summer, it was a very warm August, and there was milk aplenty in the Warsaw shops, but it was all sour, because there was no refrigeration plant in the countryside for storing the milk from the farms, and it went bad before. So, if you've got a recipe for making bread with sour milk, there was plenty in the shops. If you wanted to have milk on your cornflakes, it had this rather acid taste and lumps in it, because all the milk in the shops had gone sour. We went around looking for fresh milk, and everywhere we were told it's gone sour. start making pancakes was the answer. An awful lot of eating of pancakes, but people don't necessarily choose to do so. The distribution system in the countryside and so on is underdeveloped. The road system is underdeveloped in the countryside and so on. Now the problem of agriculture has become more severe as development has occurred, because increasingly the urban population is more and more capable of expressing its discontents. And the difficulty now is, I mean, Taglitzzi describes how in the USSR, in the 1970s, in the latter period of Brezhnev, in the 1980s, the Russian state threw resources into agriculture, poured resources into agriculture in the shape of tractors and so on and so on. In fact, there are more tractors per acre now in Russia than there are in America. It's not the case that Russia doesn't have any tractors. It's got tractors galore. But it's still backward because the whole, in a sense, agriculture hasn't got the capacity to absorb investment, because the investment needs to take place in the infrastructure of the rural area. And the whole social organisation of agriculture has become an impediment to development. The population in the rural areas has tended to be an ageing population. The young have been leaving the rural areas for the greater pleasures and excitements of the town, much more than is in the case in Western Europe. An ageing population is not the most suitable population for developing and modernising agriculture. Now, the stress on accumulation, on heavy industry growth, and so on, has meant that the last picture in these economies, that very little attention, in proportional terms, very little attention has been given to such things as safety, the environment, the health service, and so on. With two results which have become especially notable in the 1970s and 1980s in Eastern Europe. The first one is a process to which we, of course, also become sensitive in the West, of ecological degradation, particularly in the industrial areas. In Poland, it is now said that there is hardly any water in Poland which is not heavily polluted, which is suitable for drinking. There's extensive air pollution, particularly in industrial areas. There's soil pollution, soil which is now heavily contaminated with heavy metals and actually unsafe to grow vegetables and so on. It's very difficult to find measures. The problem is, the chief source of information about this has been the opposition, and one says, one doesn't want to distrust the opposition. On the other hand, perhaps the opposition exaggerates the degree of environmental degradation and so on. But there is one set of figures which is absolutely stunning, which is about individual health. Because what is apparent is that from the mid-1960s onwards, up to the mid-1960s, the indices of health show an improvement in the health of the individuals, and the falling levels of mortality and so on. Falling levels of child mortality, adult mortality and so on. From the mid-1960s, the figures turn round. Particularly they turn around for middle-aged men. There have been rising mortality rates in Poland, Hungary and the USSR since the mid-1960s, particularly for middle-aged males. And the figures, if you want to look them up, they're fairly stunning. It was produced by a Polish statistician who's looked at the mortality tables in a book by Roger Clark called Poland, the Economy in the 1980s. He's got all the tables there, and they are absolutely stunning, because the picture is one, it's still the case in Britain and in Western Europe and Japan and so on, that life expectancy is rising. In Eastern Europe it is tending to fall. Not massively, but 3 years, a reduction on average of 3 years in the life expectancy of Russian males since the mid-1960s is fairly astonishing. I had to read the thing very carefully and make sure that I was understanding what he was saying. This author writing in this book by Clark, which you'll find in the library. Now, if we consider these economies as systems, or perhaps more correctly, we should say as national parts of a world system, I prefer that way of looking at them, then I think we've got two measures of crisis in these systems. One is that they clearly have got cycles of advance and slowdown. These cycles of rush and slow, if you like, were already apparent in Russia in the 1930s, and they continued after the war, both in Russia and, of course, and in Eastern Europe. The amplitude of the cycle, if you like, the difference between the top and the bottom, is as wide as, and in some cases wider than, we find in Western European cycles. And like the cycles in Western Europe and in the world economy as a whole, they have tended, the gap between top and bottom has tended to widen over time. That's to say the cyclical effect is becoming greater. We have to remember this is a cycle effect, and that's to say that after a slowdown, or even stop, the economy does recover. And the cycle starts again. That's the first thing, there's the cyclical movement. The other kind of pattern, if you like, which I think we can identify clearly, is a long-term fall in growth rates. A growing process of stagnation in the economies. One measure of this, obviously, is the actual growth of output. Another measure of it is that the return on capital invested is falling. That's to say, it costs, to get a 1% growth rate, increase in the growth, if a 1% increase in growth, takes more and more capital investment. The capital investment becomes less efficient, if you like. Now, this, of course, is important for two reasons. Firstly, the project of these countries, in a sense, and the rulers of these countries, was to catch up and overtake the West. That project recedes from view as a possibility over time. See, I think it was in 1960, Mr. Khrushchev went to the United Nations and made a famous speech in which he took his shoe off and banged on the podium with his shoe and said, very confidently to the Americans, "We will bury you." Now, he didn't mean we will blast you to bits, he meant, we are growing faster than you. Right? Over time, that confidence that we are growing faster than you declines. Because although growth rates, of course, in the West have also slowed down, they have slowed down more in the East. And the question no longer becomes one of catching up and overtaking the West, but of making sure that the gap with the West doesn't go to any wider. That's one reason. The aim of catching up and overtaking the West becomes more difficult and more remote. The other is that, of course, popular dissatisfaction and disbelief grows as growth becomes more significant. Because one of the characteristics of Eastern Europe after the death of Stalin is that basically there's a process by which two things decline. One of them is repression. You know, actual physical repression of people declines. The other is that also ideology declines in its significance by comparison with the Stalin period. Belief becomes less important to the functioning of the system. Belief becomes less important above all at the top, but also lower down. Communist ideas, if you like, and communist teaching and the rest of it becomes less and less a characteristic. You meet members of the party from Eastern Europe in the 1980s, and you ask them, what do you have to do as a member of the party? You know, do you have to go out and agitate and propagandize and sell the paper? And good heavens, no, they say. No, once a year we have to stand out in the May Day parade. That's the level of commitment which is required. Now, if you talk to somebody in the 1940s, the early 1950s, about what party membership meant, they would have expressed commitment. The commitment level declines. The commitment level amongst the mass of the population declines. Increasingly, the stability of these societies comes to depend, as, for example, Kadar comes to recognize in Hungary in the period after the Hungarian Revolution. He makes speeches in which makes it absolutely clear there is a contract between the government and the people. We must keep raising the standard of living of the population and they will let us rule, is the basis of the contract. It's a material social contract, not one based upon ideological commitment. A kind of bargain about living standards. Now, if the problem is if the economy is slowing down, it's more difficult to fulfill the bargain. The population dissatisfaction level may rise, and so on. One last problem, which we also see in the West, though it's less acute in the West, although it's also there in the West, and we need to recognize it. And that is that in modern conditions, certainly in the conditions in Eastern Europe, when you have a crisis, that's to say a cyclical crisis in the economy, it doesn't purge the system. If you read Marx writing about the 19th century capitalist economy, he says one of the effects of a cyclical crisis in the economy is that it knocks out inefficient parts of the economy, and the whole economy therefore can recover. It's a necessary purge, like, taking X-lax, as it were. It blows the system out of some of its rubbish, and then the system can recover its health. The problem here in the East European economies is that you have cycles without purging. Now, this is also increasingly true in the West, of course, because of state intervention. But the state intervenes it is not the case as in these economies. Firms go bankrupt. If they fail to meet their planned target and so on, if they lose money in accounting terms, they don't go bankrupt. They don't get wiped out. They're not like ILG, which actually goes bust and workers are laid off and so on and so on. There's what one East European economist, Colin, called a soft budget constraint. That's to say that in the end, the enterprise manager knows that whatever he does, the enterprise will always be propped up by the state. And so the tendency is for these economies not to clear themselves of inefficiencies by economic mechanisms anyway, but rather there's a tendency to stagnation and inflation. Of course, also seen in the West. It's just that the situation is perhaps more extreme in the East. Now, I'll have to stop. I've got my timing wrong, but this really was the context. This context of increasing difficulty in the economy is the one in which issues about economic reform were posed. Because increasingly it became apparent to people inside Eastern Europe, not simply to dissidents, but to official economists, that these sorts of characteristics of the economies were slowing them down, and the question of economic growth was therefore posed in the 1960s and 1970s against a growing awareness of the background, of this sort of background in the economy. I'll have to finish talking about this next time. Do you have a copy of this handout? It's just what I read to you. So you can see I didn't make it all up, or at least I copied it from other people who made it up.